Greetings and welcome. Before we get started, I want to run through a few housekeeping notes. Use the chat to let us know where you're joining us from. All questions for our presenters need to be added to the Q&A section. If you add them to the chat, we will not be able to answer them. So please do use that Q&A section. And finally, if you have a reaction to a presentation, please feel free to use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen. Our presenters love to hear your feedback. All right. Welcome. Happy NISAW. Welcome to day 4 of our 2024 National Invasive Species Awareness Week. My name is Christy Trifone-Millhouse, your NISAW Executive Director. I want to start today by saying a big thank you to our Federal Interagency Committee for the Management of Noxious and Exotic Weeds and our presenters yesterday. For those who missed these powerful webinars, you can access all NISAW recordings next week on the NISAW YouTube channel. Our theme for this year's NISAW event is Protecting North American Biodiversity. NISAW is an international event powered by NISAW to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat they pose, and what can be done to prevent their spread. Even though we're almost to the end of our NISAW, we still have more to come. Wrapping up the week tomorrow, we will learn about on-the-ground efforts that are helping to enhance biodiversity and habitat quality with a focus on NISAW's new biodiversity position paper. This is a week not only for learning, but for action. Today and tomorrow, we will be sharing links with you in an effort to connect you with your U.S. senators and House representatives. Another call to action is to share NISAW posts and to use the resources in the NISAW toolkit. Before we jump into the main event, I'd like to take a moment to give thanks and to share some important information about NISAW. Events like this are a huge lift, and sponsorship is critical to making every aspect of this event work. A hearty thank you to our NISAW 2024 sponsors for your generous support. We value your partnership and look forward to celebrating with you this event's success. Now, just a little bit about NISAW. NISAW is deeply vested in our mission to empower the management of invasive species in North America. We are led by an eclectic 18-member board of leading experts and professionals, with supporting committees, a strong NISAW team, and a membership that continues to grow in numbers by the day. If you have any interest in participating in a committee, getting involved on our board, please feel free to reach out. We would love to have you join us. Our core programming is designed to provide our community with the connections needed to learn about advancements in the field and to share lessons learned. We also provide a collective voice for our community through events like today's NISAW. Lastly, we aim to provide the tools such as professional development, international standards, campaigns, and the NISAW Certified Weed-Free Products Program to broaden our impact and to help further our mission. One event I wanted to share with you coming up, something you won't want to miss, is our 2024 NISAW Annual Conference. Mark your calendars and plan to join over 300 attendees in Missoula on September 30th through October 3rd. Our theme for this year's event is sharing stories and celebrating partnerships. There will be over 70 sessions to attend and 2 additional events, including a symposium on invasive annual grasses, hosted by our partners at the University of Wyoming's Institute for Managing Annual Grasses Invading Natural Ecosystems, and the Invasive Annual Grasses Technical Transfer Partnership. The second event will be a continental dialogue on non-native forest insects and diseases, hosted by our partners, the Nature Conservancy. This is an event you will not want to miss. Head over to our website and get registered today. While you're there, if you're not currently a member, I strongly encourage you to join us. A membership investment in NISAW helps us to continue to do our critical work as a leading 501c3. As you can see, there are many options for you to consider. If you have any questions at all, again, please feel free to reach out. Okay, Now for our main event. I'd like to introduce you to our NISAW partner and sponsor, Chris Boomsma, Executive Director for the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you all today and be part of this larger event. I just wanted to provide you just some brief background on the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology if you're unaware of us. So we are a 501(c)(3) membership-supported nonprofit organization. We were stood up in 1972 as the result of a 1970 National Academy of Sciences report that said we need to be doing a better job of communicating science. We are proudly nonpartisan, apolitical, and unbiased, always sticking to the science. We are, like NASMA, a membership-supported organization. That membership is not only individuals, though, it is also organizations. And you can see from the screen at this time the variety of organizations, the types that is, that contribute to CAST and make our mission possible. And in 2022, we were happy to celebrate 50 years of existence. Our mission is to convene and coordinate networks of experts to assemble, interpret, and communicate credible, unbiased, science-based information to policymakers, the media, the private sector, and the public. And today we are doing that very thing, working with NASMA to convene and coordinate networks of experts. And you'll hear from those experts today. How do we accomplish this mission? Through the use of a lot of volunteers. A lot of people give of their time and their talents to CAST, and we're very, very thankful for them. From 65 board members to nearly 200 active task force members working on CAST reports, to a whole slew of other people, whether they're reviewing reports, producing webinars, or doing a variety of other things. We have many, many volunteers that make our work possible. On the right of that slide on your screen at this time, you can see what sectors they come from. So I just want to thank again everyone for joining today. It's a real privilege to be partnering with this special event. And so with that, we'll move on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. We're so glad to have you here. And again, thanks so much for sponsoring NISAW. All right, now I'm going to pass the mic over to NASMA's Government Relations Director, Elizabeth Brown, who will be moderating our session today.
Thank you, Chris and Christy. Appreciate those informative introductions. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers to you today. Dia Lorience, Assistant Professor of Invasive Species Biology and Management at Penn State University, and Teresa Cully, Professor of Plant Ecology and past head of the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Cincinnati. Thank you so much for being with us today. You can go ahead and share your screens now.
First, I just want to thank the organizers and NASMA in particular for this opportunity to present. I think I speak for Teresa as well during National Invasive Species Awareness Week and share the work that we've been doing on risk assessment. And so consider this a preview of the paper that should be coming out very soon. It's in production. And just want to take the time here to acknowledge our co-authors, Mark Brand, Susan Canavan, Kurt Daler, Chris Evans, and Ruben Keller. So taking a step back, we'll do a little background here, and it might be review for some folks, but really think about, as I talk about these concepts with biological invasions, how it might fit in with risk assessment. And so when you think about biological invasions, you think about impacts to natural systems. And one of the biggest ones is biodiversity decline. And the IPBES report that came out late last year, I think the final draft came out a couple weeks ago. Basically, scientists from all around the world got together and did a global assessment of invasive species. And so putting this together, here's a figure showing the contributions of each taxonomic group to local extinctions. And of course, the vertebrates here, and you see the rat, those are on the higher end, but plants are responsible for over 15% of the global extinctions. And then impacts can be really obvious to the eye. This is a Melaleuca fire in the Everglades. You've got densely packed Melaleuca trees that are full of volatiles in a lightning-prone system. And you get these really hot, fast fires. And then it opens up at the end. There's disturbance, so other invaders can come back in. And so that's really obvious, but there's a ton of impacts that you can't see. Things that might be happening below ground, changes in the chemistry or the hydrology, the way the water moves through the system. And biological invasions are also expensive. They cost us a lot of money. This is again from that same report showing the annual cost globally in billions here from 1970 to 2019. And you can just look at that slope of just how quickly we're spiking in these costs, with an estimated 423 billion in 2019 alone globally. And important to note that the folks that put this together really are making it clear that this is likely an underestimate. A group called Invicos, they're like a collective that are putting together other economic information about biological invasions. They've estimated that since 1960 in North America, we've seen management costs almost $100 billion since 1960. And the same group, a different publication here, looked at the top 10 species that were spending money on management versus prevention. And so the management is in the pink and the prevention is in the blue. And they've calculated that we're spending about 25 times less on prevention efforts. And there are opportunities for new introductions to come. This is, again, from that same IPBES report, but this is Hanno Siebens' work. He's been keeping track of these species accumulations through time and, separating it by your taxonomic groups. But you can look across here and just see again, that slope. It's not saturating for most of these scenarios. And then this is going to continue to get worse with climate change. We're going to have altered social dynamics, human migration. We're going to change the way we do our tourism. And then combine that with increased connectivity with pathways, we're going to see even more species introductions and changes to the ones that we already have here with your range shifters. And the impacts are going to intensify with climate change. So just some examples here. Frequent extreme weather events, quite a few tornadoes in winter, a lot more intensity increasing with our hurricanes. Well, that provides opportunities for invasive species movement. Increased carbon dioxide is predicted to change the efficacy of how we treat these species. So herbicide resistance, or maybe our biocontrols won't behave the same way. We also have changes in species life cycles. So you have a warming climate, longer time for these things to grow. Maybe your forest pests can get another generation in. And then finally, we can have favorable conditions for increased spread of those invasives. And here we see the invasion curve. It probably looks familiar to a few of you, but it's very simple. Oops. You have a species that's introduced here, and as you move through time, your area infested increases, and so do your control costs. And also your likelihood of eradicating a species decreases. And this is divided into prevention, eradication, containment, and long-term maintenance control. I will also add that there was an economic study that was done in Australia a few years ago that showed the return on investment for every dollar spent on prevention, they were estimating about $100 return, as opposed to, your diminishing returns across this curve, where when we're in long-term maintenance control, it could be a 1-to-1 or $1 to $5 relationship. For all of these reasons, we want to stay in this prevention end of the curve. And here's another conceptual diagram outlining the process of invasion. So at the very tippity top, you see import. That's where you have to have a species introduced. Then you have an establishment phase. For a lot of species, you'll see a lag period. So they just kind of hang out there until they get the right amount, either the conditions or the right number of individuals in the population to spill out. And then now you've got your spread. And then from there, you have your ecological and socioeconomic impacts. And so at the establishment phase, say you're a plant and you can't tolerate the either extreme highs or lows in temperature, or you're not getting the right precipitation, this can break this cycle or break this process. Similarly, in the spread phase, if a plant requires a specialist pollinator like this bat here, but the bat wasn't brought over with the plant, it's likely not going to spread. It's not going to be able to reproduce. And so just showing how we could break that process, very important to point out that not all introductions become problems. And in fact, a lot of non-native species are very beneficial to us. So bringing this to risk assessment and thinking of all the things I just put out there, risk assessment evaluates the likelihood that an event can happen and the consequences of that event. Here you see the probability, that's your introduction, establishment, spread, and the magnitude of impact, well, that's your consequence. And looking at this in this risk matrix, you can see it's really helpful for visualization. So if you've got near certain or likely probability something can happen with these high, massive and major impacts, it's going to be a high risk situation. But if you're down here in unlikely to happen and maybe minor or negligible impacts, well, your risk is going to be lower. And so risk assessment, the purpose is to predict which non-native species are most likely to pass through these successive stages that you see here. So it's really intended for species that haven't been introduced yet to really stay on that prevention end. But in some cases, you can use risk assessment for species with new uses. So that might be an ornamental grass, large stature grass that now we're looking at for biofuel. And you're going to go from one in the landscape to hundreds of acres. We use traits of a plant to determine the success or failure of that species moving through the process. And through the years of invasion ecology, we've collected a lot of information and identified many common traits among successful invaders, including high above ground growth rates, like this patch of privet, effective seed dispersal. You see a robin here with a honeysuckle berry, bright showy fruits, effective to attract birds and spread them around. And this last photo is a tip from a melaleuca tree. All of those little dusty things, those are all seeds. And it's estimated that one tree can have up to 10 million seeds. So this demonstrates high reproductive output. And then we include impacts as the estimate of that consequence. And so there are many, many tools. Co-author Susan Canavan and I are working on another paper processing a survey we did, a global survey of risk assessment practitioners. And we pulled together something like 40 to 50 individual tools that people are using across taxonomic groups, not just plants. But that's a pretty large number. But we'll start down here. This Australian weed risk assessment is one of the first ones in '99. I know Sarah Reichert had a decision support tree that was also, I believe that was '97. So right around that time, people were really starting to think about predicting risk. And risk assessment has a place in biosecurity. Biosecurity is a set of policies and protocols that are directed towards preventing introduction, spread, or impact of harmful organisms. And this can include prohibition of entry, surveillance, quarantine, and control of those species of concern. And so we want to use risk assessment to identify those potential species as a critical component of this process. So that, the don't pack a pest beagle there, being a very good boy, knows what it's looking for. Or, this inspector knows what he's screening for. So that's the role of risk assessment for protecting our borders. And here's an example. It's a biosecurity program for forest pests in Australia. So don't really focus on all the little things. I just wanted to point out this can be very complicated. But down here in this pre-border, this is where you're seeing the risk assessment come in. So it's really integrated into large-scale biosecurity activity. And there are international standards that have been developed by the International Plant Protection Convention. They keep up with this, it's global. And so periodically update these things. But just a couple highlights here. They recommend including uncertainty so that you're being transparent and documenting the quality of the information and the amount of the information that you have. And then documentation in general is, again, transparency, but that goes from showing why you started a risk assessment all the way through how you did that risk assessment. And so there are three different approaches. The first is a qualitative approach. And this is risk assessment assessed via expert opinion through consensus. So you bring a group of folks together who have knowledge about the task at hand. In this case, we'll say plants. And they get together and they talk about the different traits and impacts that they're seeing. And at the end of the day, they make a vote and the consensus wins. And in fact, this is how a lot of the early non-regulatory invasive plant council lists were started. And, sometimes it can be written down on paper too. One of the decision support conceptual framework here, you can work your way through with your group in that way. And so the advantages are that anyone can raise a point that they feel is important, and the decision carries the weight of the expert's reputation. The disadvantages are that it may be difficult to explain how you reach that decision. So there's your transparency piece, and different experts may reach different conclusions. So depending on who's sitting at the table, you might have different value or have a different interpretation of what is a bad impact. This often takes time with repeated meetings and a lot of resources, and it's not ideal for these rapidly spreading species. The second approach is semi-quantitative, where we combine scientific data and expert information to answer standardized questions to determine risk. And so, you can use peer-reviewed literature, some of the databases that we have out there. Global Biodiversity Information Facility has just a ton of information and occurrence data. You can use EDMAPS or CABI. There's quite a bit of reliable information available on the web. But, there's also value in including information that you have from your practitioners, the folks who are intimately working with that species on the ground. So they know what it's doing to the environment. They know what impacts are happening. They are observing how it's spreading. Similarly, researchers, this is my friend Laura Meyerson here in a field of Phragmites. As an academic, we don't publish everything we know. It's hard to get published sometimes, and there's a lot of information that we just have that isn't publicly available. So filling those gaps as you're doing one of these assessments, you can really, really get a full picture and a strong conclusion. And I'm going to give a few examples of these types of assessments. First, the Australian Weed Risk Assessment. I mentioned earlier, 1999, we kind of considered this the OG risk assessment. It's very widely used. 49 questions on domestication, cultivation history, climate tolerances, invasiveness elsewhere, and some of those biological traits. How does it reproduce and spread? And each of those questions you answer yes or no, most of them, and it's like -1 to 1, the range of the scoring. Some are weighted higher than others. But you take that cumulative score and then put it into these scoring thresholds. So anything less than a 1 is low risk, but anything over 6 is high risk. And this was all determined by putting known major, minor, and non-invaders through the tool to set those thresholds. The other thing I want to say about this particular tool is that Dory Gordon and Krista Gantz did a study looking at the accuracy of this tool across geography, so different sizes and places from islands to continents, and determined that it was about 90% accurate at catching your major invaders. So for a very simple tool to use, you do get some good results, accurate results. The second tool is the Plant Protection Quarantine Weed Risk Assessment, or you might hear it referred to as a PPQ-WRA. This is the federal model that USDA uses. And there are 3 major analytical components. So you have your assessment of establishment and spread and impact potential here. So where this looks more like your risk matrix, where you've split these 2 scores, and there's a logistical model that puts the final placement of that species based on how you answer questions. And while you answer each of these questions, you also indicate your level of certainty for the information and your answer. And with that, that's put through a Monte Carlo simulation to show what level of certainty, how well did this assessor feel that they had captured all the information and quality information. And so you really want to see this come as close as possible to this area. I will also say that all the little X's and dots and triangles in different colors in the first figure, that the assessments that they did to set their thresholds for this particular tool. The final element is this geopotential modeling, where they take 3 different layers in GIS: precipitation, hardiness zones, and Copen-Geiger classes, and look at occurrence data and basically map this out to show where the risk applies. And I just also want to mention that for this particular tool, the newer assessments, you'll see both of those first 2 panels put together on the same figure. And I don't have as much experience with this one. Teresa's worked with this Ohio tool, but basically you'll see the number of viable seeds, impacts, some of the same kinds of questions within that tool as well. And then the advantages are that we have more consistent and systematic procedure. It removes sources of bias due to the justifications. You're writing down why you answered those questions the way you did. And it may be relatively quick using the tool. So again, Doria Gordon's work has shown it takes about 8 to 16 hours to do one of the AWRAs. The disadvantage is the development of the tool requires substantial investment in research and testing. I mentioned we have like 40 or 50 tools, so maybe we don't need to keep making new ones. And it assumes that traits are independent and additive and cannot interact. And this still relies on some expert judgment and subjectivity in answering those questions. The final approach is quantitative, and here we use statistical algorithms, mathematical models, empirical data to develop a risk assessment tool. And this figure is just showing you the back end of one of these models where you've got, all of your different introduction, establishment, spread. This one follows that process and then divides your impacts up. But all of this goes in, you got weighted arithmetic means and equations here at the end. This is the Harmonia Plus model. This is one used in Europe that strives for maximal compliance with those international standards that I mentioned. It also has been modified for pathogens. So if you see Pandora Plus, that's what that model is about. And this is what your interface looks like online. You answer your questions, you click on a tab, answer your questions through, and just hit compute, and it spits out your result. So the advantages of this are very few traits may be required to identify your species. Once a tool is developed, it may be fast and less bias and more objectivity and more transparency. For the disadvantages, we see the outcome, it might be counterintuitive for some with no mechanical explanation, and it could be challenging to explain your results to policymakers, managers, and the general public. And so with that, I'm going to pass off to Teresa.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dia. So what I wanted to do next is to give examples of where risk assessment is especially critical. And so the first one we're going to talk about is, of course, bioenergy. And so if you think about it, there's a lot of emphasis in today's world on lessening our dependence upon fossil fuels and increasing sustainability. And so sometimes the whole conversation about biofuels moves over to plants. And you could see over here, this is an article from Science in 2018, so a few years ago, talking about how plants are important trees. We'll talk about a few other examples in just a moment. But it's important to think about bioenergy and biofuels as groups of plants, usually one species that's going to be planted in a huge monoculture that also shares a lot of key traits with invasive species. And so that makes these types of plants, when they're being projected to be planted out in mass in the environment, we really need to be thinking about, is that the best thing? And we really need to be doing a risk assessment of that. What you could see is where those risk assessments, a case where this has been done, and this is in Florida, where they have a non-native planting rule. Essentially, if anyone wants to plant for a biomass planting for biofuels, anywhere from greater than 2 acres, and it could be like eucalyptus shown here, or miscanthus, which, by the way, is a different species than the one that's planted ornamentally in our yards. But if anyone wants to do this, then, and again, if it's larger than 2 acres, the state of Florida requires a permit. And in the permitting process, it does require a risk assessment. So this, I think, is actually a good idea. I want to show you on the next slide another example. This is more in line with what I actually do. If we think about ornamental plants, so it turns out that many gardeners, if they're looking for plants they want to put in their yards, they're seeking out these horticultural plants they can buy in a plant nursery. Many of those plants have traits that are associated with invasiveness. And so these traits are shown here, and you could see a number of them. So if someone's growing some plants in their yard, they might not have a green thumb. They want to have something they can't kill. So they want to have wide ecological tolerance, hardiness. They want something that's going to grow really fast, especially if it's a tree. They want something that has lots of flowers and ideally a short time to producing those flowers, or maybe fruit if it's a fruit tree. And of course, you want something that's highly resistant to diseases and pests. Now, there's also consequences of this use of these plants. And so one of the consequences is that if you think about this, the ornamental pathway is a way to have multiple introductions of a plant species. So you could buy a plant at your plant nursery down the street, you can go to a big box store, the same species might be sold all throughout the country. The other consequence of using plants in this way is that it oftentimes involves the development of cultivated varieties known as cultivars. These are different clones, if you will, genotypes of the same species. And I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. What we've recognized now is that if we look at known invasive species that are known to be already spreading today, and if we look back and try to find out through the literature or any information we might have, whether those plants were ever used in horticulture in the past or perhaps currently, it turns out that there is a link. So Ricard and White in 2001 did a really nice study of woody species across North America. They showed that greater than 80% of those known woody invasive species have a link to horticulture, either in the past or the present. So we wanted to update that number. And so we used the Midwest Invasive Plant Network's list of invasive species, now only in the Midwestern US in those states. But then what we did was we included not only the woodies that were looked at earlier, but also vines and herbaceous species. And as you can see in the graph here, we classified those as to, first of all, the method of introduction, intentional, accidental, and in some cases you don't know. And then for intentional introductions, we separated those into the colored categories you see here with a focus on the purple, which is of ornamental use. So as you could see from these photographs, these are just some examples of woody species we were talking about. But if you go to the graph on the left, you can see that 89% of known invasive woody species have a link either past or current to horticulture. So those are woodies. On the next slide, we're going to look at vines. And here you can see the story is somewhat similar. Again, you could see some typical vine species. I want to note that the amber pepper vine in the middle, at least in Ohio, is one of the up-and-comer ones. But you can see here that a lot of these vines have been intentionally introduced, about 65% of them for ornamental purposes. And actually almost less than a third have been accidentally introduced. The next slide, we're going to focus now on herbaceous species, which haven't really been looked at up to this point. And here you could see, first of all, about 31% of herbaceous species have been intentionally introduced for ornamental purposes through the years. And then the other interesting thing is if you look at accidental, 43% of herbs have been accidentally introduced. And so that's interesting. These specimens, just to note here, the one on the right, of course, is an aquatic species. And the one on the left is field bindweed. If you don't have that in your yard or your pasture, be very grateful because it's very difficult to get rid of. On the next slide, what I wanted to show is that because we now know there's this link between invasive species and an ornamental use in some cases, we now have putatively seedless cultivars that are being marketed. And I'm saying putatively because oftentimes they're marketed as seedless or low seed. And the idea is that many times these are species such as the Callery pear, Pyrus calleriana, or Lythrum virgatum, where they have an inherent genetic self-incompatibility mechanism where a given plant cannot cross-pollinate itself. So if you clone that as a cultivar, all cultivars of the same type cannot cross with themselves. But here's where the challenge is. It's not ideal because anytime someone plants another tree, say you have a whole bunch of Bradford Callery pears in one area where people live, and then someone plants an aristocrat, suddenly that aristocrat can cross with all the other Bradfords. So that's the problem. So a potential solution here on the next slide is that breeders and developers have been coming up with new sterile cultivars. An example here is the Chastity pear. I had to show that because I love the name. But what happens is that these are usually created by a manipulation of ploidy, the number of chromosomes in a plant. And so usually these are triploid species. This is another example. This is a burning bush and known as Fireball. And this is a seedless variety that's a triploid. And it just, I believe, is being sold for the first time this spring. However, it's important to note that when we're talking about sterility, that's a pretty loaded term. So what we're looking for really is a sterile cultivar is one that needs to be both seed sterile, doesn't produce any seeds or viable seeds, but it also needs to be pollen sterile. It's not going to be producing any pollen that's viable that gets out. The other thing is it's important for sterility to continue on through the different generations. So that's something that has to really be looked at. So it turns out that if we think about cultivars, a lot of the risk assessments that Dia already talked about, oftentimes they're not developed for cultivars. And remember, a lot of those have very specific questions or information they're looking for. And that might be really difficult to obtain from these cultivated plants because it might be considered proprietary information. And so really we're reliant in some cases on information from breeders and growers and people who have developed the plant species. And of course, field trial comparisons are immensely helpful, especially if they are realistic. And so what I mean by that is if you're testing out, say, a new calorie pair cultivar, you really need to be growing it along with other cultivars in the area. And then climatic changes are also important. If you have a cultivar that doesn't produce seed, say, up north in Wisconsin, you need to double check and make sure it doesn't produce seed lower in a southern state, say, if it's able to grow within that area. So that's really important. The other thing that we wanted to emphasize is this next point. And before we get to that, I wanted to mention that there is a risk assessment that is developed for cultivated plants, and that's out of California, known as PRE-T, the Plant Risk Evaluator Tool. And that was put forward by an organization known as Plant Right. So there is one out there. But what Dee and I wanted to get across too that's important is, again, risk assessments we've already talked about are only used to predict invasion risk, so predictive in a way. And so if you're thinking about economic impacts, say to the industry, those really should not be included because those are subsequent. They don't influence whether a plant is invasive, this is invasive risk, but they might come into play afterwards. If a plant is determined to be invasive, then some states have different mechanisms where they look at that after that fact. But we wanted to be clear to mention that. So in the time I have left, I wanted to focus a little bit on the challenges, but we're also going to flip those around into opportunities. So what I wanted to do is go through some of those. So the first one is a challenge is that some of the tools that we've already talked about, some of these are actually misunderstood as risk assessments. Remember, risk assessments are looking at the overall invasion risk to environments, to natural areas. But some tools, they only take one step. They're only highlighting one aspect. So the ICAT here is the Environmental Impact Classification for Alien Taxa. It's an IUCN, so an international tool, and it's helping prioritize invasive species, but it's only looking at impacts, so nothing before that. So the solution here, though, and the opportunity is if we can take these rankings, this categorization that has been used with this other tool, for individual species, we can still use that as a source for the impact portion in subsequent risk assessments. So that can be a win-win. So that's an opportunity. Another challenge is that we really need more information about accidental introductions of non-natives, so about the mechanisms. So we've already talked about how many species are introduced accidentally. It does happen oftentimes through ports of entry, and if we think about the US or anywhere globally, we know that travel globally and shipping and online commerce and everything are only exploding and increasing. And so that's going to increase the number of chances a non-native is going to be moving around. And if we knew how this would happen, we can actually target these mechanisms for prevention. Again, risk assessment is a lot of it is about preventing this even from happening in the first place. So we can actually turn this challenge around a little bit, and the opportunity is we really need to increase inspections at US ports of entry. And then I'm also adding in through mail order, but more importantly through online commerce, Etsy, Amazon, those types of places where people are selling plants on their own and moving seeds around. We really need to have more funding for inspectors and increased APHIS screening. You'd be amazed how limited the number of inspectors we have in North America. We really need to have more funding to increase that. I'd also add we really need to have better communication of state regulators. If we have a case where in one state there's a law or rulemaking procedure to ban the regulation or ban the sale and distribution of one species, but it's not in the next state, we need to have greater communication among those regulators. And then also, we also noted also about biosecurity. So the next challenge is that, as I had mentioned earlier, most risk assessments are really not designed for cultivars. So it turns out when you run a cultivar through a risk assessment, sometimes we already mentioned it's hard to get the information, the data that you might need, but cultivars oftentimes are included under parental taxa, especially in regulatory lists. So if a species is listed on a regulatory list, banned from sale and distribution, then usually the cultivars are automatically included underneath that. But oftentimes there's a stipulation that if the cultivar could be shown to be sterile and not dangerous in any way and won't escape, then it could be allowed, but yet there's not really many mechanisms. So we do have some cultivars. This is winter creeper as an example. I mentioned we have more sterile polyploid cultivars being developed, so we need to have a way to actually now really assess cultivars. So the opportunity here is actually to develop a national cultivar assessment tool. I know of different people working slightly in different areas on that, but it does require coordination of states and agencies. We need to have information from growers. And as we mentioned, it really shouldn't include the economic impacts because that's separate from the issue of invasion. The next challenge is the fact that some non-native species are only identified as invasive after they spread substantially in natural areas. And so, as we had talked about earlier, oftentimes is later on in the diagram where ecological and economic costs have already incurred. So the opportunity is really to start thinking about proactive approaches. And horizon scanning is one of these proactive approaches that looks at species even before they're introduced to prioritize those species for assessment. So it's very effective in preventing introduction of species shown to be invasive elsewhere. So that's important. And of course, to do this, we need funding. The next challenge, and we're getting more towards the end here, is that it turns out that lots of states and agencies are conducting risk assessments on the same species at the same time, duplicating their time, effort, and resources. There's not any coordination or very limited coordination. And then some of these risk assessments depend upon the scientific literature. And when you go and you look, you might get this image where you're blocked by a paywall. So the opportunity here is actually to create a national resource of protocols, tools, completed assessments, and supporting sources like peer-reviewed literature to meet these global standards. And this is already starting to get started, but we need to move it along a little further. And of course, this would be for those quantitative and semi-quantitative assessments mentioned earlier. So the idea that is anyone doing an assessment could download that information, contribute their own information, and it could be a really rich repository of information. And this, of course, would increase efficacy and speed of the assessments. The last challenge that I wanted to mention is that really, if you think about risk assessments overall, there's a lack of consistency and comparability of those assessments across regions, but also across international borders. So there's different tools, methods of standardization, and so forth. So the opportunity here is that what we would suggest is there needs to be a way and efforts to create a more robust approach. And this could be done by coalescing the tools currently used in the US, maybe add in some international tools, but really adopt international standards. And so this is critical because it will require coordination across lots of different people, groups, and boundaries. But ultimately, if we could do this, and I really believe we can, it's going to result in the implementation of really effective risk management and assessment strategies globally, even if the tools differ. If we all decide on international standards and we follow those standards, we would have a lot of progress based on what we can do, more so than what we have done today. So I just want to leave you with some other considerations just to highlight. We already talked about best practices. We need that transparency. Incorporating uncertainty is really important. It would be ideal to have comparisons of the same species among those 3 different risk assessment approaches. I think that would be great to have. We also need more information. We have information gaps at different points for different species. And then finally, I want to leave you with the idea that global climate change is here. And we really need to think about how to best incorporate that into risk assessments. So we have range shifts of plants, we have biofuels I mentioned earlier, sea ice melt is altering shipping routes. So we really need to start thinking about risk assessments through the lens of global climate change. So finally, I just want to wrap it up. Dee already started talking about how this was set up. I also want to thank our co-authors of this paper, which is in production, as Dee mentioned, and we are hoping that it gets out very soon. And hopefully you can all read about this work, and we would love to hear your ideas and also to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. You gave us a lot to think about. This is really incredibly important work, and we so appreciate your expertise being shared with us today. Lots of praise coming in the chat and through the reactions. Hopefully you can see all of our virtual audience clapping loud for you right now. We do have a couple of questions I'll be happy to ask. And if anybody listening has more questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. The first one is, what risk assessment tools are best suited for locations where needed data like plant occurrence, impact, climate models, etc., are lacking compared to other regions? Compared to the contiguous 48 states, there isn't nearly as much data on invasive plants in Alaska. And either, yeah, go ahead.
I will say that a project I'm working on right now is a horizon scan for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And one of the challenges that we had was with our climate matching. And just for those that don't know what horizon scanning is, basically we build a group of people, experts, and then we get a list of species that aren't in the area of concern, and then we run them through rapid risk assessment. So there is risk assessment in this. But we also had a climate matching component to that project, and we were having some difficulties because there just weren't a lot of points. There weren't a lot of occurrence records on the islands. And so I think that's one of the challenges. I would also say, just in general, we get a lot of information out of herbarium records. And I know, what's the herbarium that might be closing? Was it Duke?
That was Duke. Yeah, that we're very concerned about.
Yeah, so we get a lot of information from those records. I mean, there are notes in there in many cases, and I personally have seen a decline in vouchers being taken. And I don't know if this answers the question, but that's a data deficiency that I think folks could fill just by following through with some submitting to your local herbarium or closest herbarium, or maybe talk to your county extension agent. They should be able to connect you with a place to put that stuff.
And I'm going to hop in if I can. So what I would also put a plug in is for if people want to get involved and getting this information like Dia's talking about, it's critical to know where the species are. It's also critical to know where they aren't. But one source is EdMaps, and maybe we can post the link there. iNaturalist is sometimes used. I actually use EdMaps a lot. It's curated so people check those reports. And so that's a good way of seeing if a species is showing up or spreading. And it's also has records down to the county. And if you click on it, oftentimes it goes, if it's a herbarium record, and that's sort of the gold standard, you can go there and you can actually even look at the plant. If no one knows what a herbarium specimen is, it's the plant, it's pressed and it's glued down and it's dated and where it's from. And so we use herbaria. We have samples that are like 200 years old. It's great.
Yeah, and there is a lot of times with those EdMap records too, if you're a land manager taking that point data with a picture, some folks really do a good job of putting in, this is plant community type, this is the cover, the percent cover, things like that too. So there are different little tricks to find information in little corners.
Yes, thank you. I use herbarium records actually quite a bit, and I work mostly with aquatic plants, and there's a lot lacking. We could use a lot more. Okay, and Tegan posted the link to EdMaps in the chat. And if anybody's interested, we do have an EdMaps Summit coming up virtually very soon, I think in April. Tegan just posted the link to that so you can get more training on EdMaps. So quick little plug for that upcoming event on EdMaps. Okay, and let's see. Could AI prove beneficial for data utilization and ease of input?
That's a great question. I'm right in the middle of developing a policy on using AI for one of our society journals. So we've been thinking a lot about the use of AI in scientific research. I do think that there is some possibilities about using AI, but we'd have to be very careful because AI, I always tell my students and my daughter, AI is stupid. It's from a computer and it only knows what we tell it. So with AI, you have to train it on data beforehand. So I still think even if you're using AI, you still need to have that human eye double checking things. And again, even if we use AI, it has to depend upon some data. And so that's where, just like what we talked about with records, notification records or EdMaps or whatever you're using, we need to have that information in there upon which the AI could work. So I think it has potential. I'm not going to jump on that bandwagon just yet because I'm trying to see how it rolls out, and AI is developing, by the day. I don't know what Dia thinks.
Yeah, so I've actually just started playing around. There's a couple AI sites that do lit review. It still feels like cheating. I will say that. I feel like I'm cheating every time, but I've been kind of testing it out. I paid for a full subscription so that you literally can either search what PDFs are in their library, or you can upload your own and it will analyze. And it's pretty accurate so far at pulling out bulleted points of conclusions, of methods. The practical implications are sometimes a little fishy, but overall I'm pretty impressed with it, but so far it's not doing a good job for answering specific questions, but it's doing a good job helping me write papers. So I think there's value in it, but I would stress again what Teresa said. You have to have a human eye on it to really validate and make sure, there's the story about the lawyers that got disbarred because they were using ChatGPT to write briefs, and the ChatGPT was just making up law. And so I think that's where a human could have helped those folks out.
That's a good example. Lesson learned for all of us there, huh? Can you provide websites or examples where somebody can do a risk assessment for a specific plant species online? Do we have that?
So I can jump in. It depends. So it depends upon why they're doing it. So if they want an official risk assessment, I would recommend, depending upon where they are, they can certainly contact an invasive plant council in their state, or sometimes they're called pest councils. Oftentimes they're looking for people, like in Ohio, I'm always looking for people to help me run assessments. People do need to be trained to do the assessment because those questions look simple, but there's some subjectivity or interpretation. And so that's important. I'm trying to think, like for Ohio, all of our assessment, our protocol and everything's online. People can run their own if they wanted to. And that's the importance of transparency we talked about. The PPQ, the WRA that Dia had mentioned, that one you could go through. It's really nice. You can see the assessment. You could see all the results of the assessments. So you could dig around and find those information, but it also depends on what's the purpose of why they're doing it. If they want to contribute to an effort, then definitely get connected. But if they're just curious, to run something through, there's assessments available out there.
Yeah, and the only interface that I know of I think California's might be something you can do directly through the website, but that Harmonia assessment that I was mentioning, that one does have a interface. The template is all because all the equations are built into it. But as far as I know, there's no online template for the AWRA or the PPQ model.
Okay, thank you. And this will probably be our last question. And then if we didn't answer your question, I'll share them with the speakers and we can certainly follow up. How would you envision global risk assessment standards account for differences of risk to large land masses versus island biogeography?
Yeah, I would say that in terms of the global standards, a lot of them are about the procedure, not I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but the procedure, not the application. So it's like, do you incorporate uncertainty? This is how you think about this land mass versus this land mass. So you would have a checklist of the standards if you were building a tool, which please don't make any more tools. But you would go through with the checklist. Did I do this? Did I do this? And I will say that one of the other standards that it was recommended in a paper, I'm not sure it made it into the official ones, but Helen Roy's group did a workshop they identified 14 recommended standards, and one of those was to incorporate climate change, which I think Harmonia does. And that was the only one that we found that actually does incorporate climate change, which, as an aside, I'm working on trying to do that for a status assessment to kind of get that climate change element in there, because we've got to start thinking about that on this arena and start doing a better job planning for the future.
Yes. Well, that's a great note to end on in terms of planning for the future. Thank you both so much. This was incredibly informative and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your time and energy to be here with us today. That concludes today's webinar. I would like to just again reiterate my gratitude on behalf of everyone at NASMA and all of our partners. Thank you to our sponsors for NISAW 2024, and a special thanks to CAST for partnering on this event and being a NISAW sponsor with us this year. We have one more webinar tomorrow, Protecting North American Biodiversity from Invasive Species. I am so excited for tomorrow's event. We will hear about a new report from NatureServe on the status of biodiversity in North America. And then we'll have our legislative committee chair on and a few other experts to share NASMA's new position paper on biodiversity. So please join us tomorrow. The link is in your chat. And as always, we have lots of resources and opportunities to learn more and take action at nisaw.org. Please visit. And with that, thank you again, everyone who attended today, our presenters and our sponsors. We appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great rest of your day.